So welcome everyone to another episode of The County for Old Cars, and today you join me with Tess, my 1967 Mark I Triumph Vitesse 2 litre, and we are about to take a little journey through some very pretty country lanes here in East Suffolk to a village called Iken, which is just downstream from Snape, between Snape and Aldeburgh. And what I'm hoping to do is to just take a peek at one of Suffolk's most interesting little churches. And we've got a beautiful day, as you can see. Spring is well underway. We're surrounded by these wonderful mature oak trees, which are not quite in leaf at the moment, but a couple of weeks' time the whole landscape is going to change. So this road we're on at the moment takes us around the back of Glenham Hall, property which has just come onto the market for 19 million, I noticed the other day. But it takes us sort of past the estate and on to the village of Blacksall. And Blacksall is perhaps famous in this area because it forms the backdrop of the writer George Ewart Evans's books. If you're not familiar with these were books based on a series of interviews that Evans made with local residents of this rural Suffolk village back in the 1960s, when he was really trying to develop an oral history of life in the village and the farm before mechanisation. And so his books are entitled The Horse in the Furrow, Ask the Fellows Who Cut the Hay, The Farm and the Village, etc. And they provide a wonderful snapshot of an era before the Second World War and before the sort of mechanisation of farming, when the village and the farm were in a sense one unitary social body, but also completely dependent upon each other for labour and income. I'm not sure if this microphone is sensitive enough to pick this up, but if it is, you might notice, those of you who are familiar to this channel and familiar with this car, that Tess's engine is a little bit quieter than it has been previously, and this is in large part due to the efforts of David and John at Anglian Triumph Services, who recently had her MOT'd and gave her a full service, during which time they decided to thank you. So I'll start my commentary again. So David and John at Anglian Triumph Services in Ditchingham, when they took the car in for a service and MOT, they noticed that the tappets were very rattly, and in fact what they've been able to do for me is to swap out the rocker assembly for a replacement one, and that has meant that the car sounds much quieter and smoother. And it could be my imagination, A bit like washing a car and then finding it always seems to run better when it's clean, but it certainly seems to have had a beneficial impact on its performance. Now, whether that is because they've been able to set the tappet gaps that much more accurately, or whether it's simply wishful thinking on my part, I'm not entirely sure, but either way I'm very grateful. And she sounds absolutely wonderful at the moment. And that brings me on to a point actually about the whole subject of MOTs. A few years ago, when the requirement to have all cars MOT'd was changed, and so vehicles over the age of 40 that had not been modified became exempt, I decided that I would simply have one of my local mechanics who looks after my modern cars and has done work on the old cars as well, just to give the Vitesses an annual safety inspection, a bit like a quick sort of pre-MOT check. And that's worked really well. But a few weeks ago, my wife and I were in this car headed towards Felixstowe for lunch, and we suddenly had an issue with the front discs, in the sense that one of the calipers on the near side front caliper seized on, and I didn't realise this until I had to apply the brakes while we were doing about 60 miles an hour in lane 1 on the A14, and the effect of putting the brakes on with the near side caliper seized was to actually push the car into lane 2. Now, luckily there's nothing coming behind me or to the side of me, and I managed to sort of correct the steering and come off the brakes quickly. But I realised immediately what had happened, and my suspicion was that the flexible hoses had begun to collapse and were acting as a one-way valve, and in effect that's what happened. But consequently, I decided that it would be much safer, given the amount of mileage that I do and also the speeds at which I drive these Vitesses, it would be much safer to get a formal MOT test. So for the first time in about 3 years, this car has a fresh MOT certificate, and I think it's something that I am actually going to go back to doing on an annual basis. There's an aspect of just having peace of mind, but I think one could also look at it as a sort of investment as well, in that if I ever had to sell either of these cars, being able to show a buyer that there were consecutive MOT certificates throughout my ownership is probably going to be an advantage. But I think certainly when it comes to things like brakes and steering, the lesson learned on the A14 was not to take a chance with these things, and consequently this one has been in for its MOT and full service, and John and David at Anglian Triumph Services currently have my Mark II Bess in for the same purpose. So the next few films that we do will probably be done in this car. So we're just on the road from Snape to Iken here, and it's a nice undulating road with some nice gentle bends to it. And fast enough to make use of the overdrive, but we're going to be turning left here, and en route to the village I'm going to pause just to give you a view of the Ald estuary. slightly more interesting view rather than the back of my head. And the reason for changing the camera angle will become apparent in a second. Now this, I should explain, is one of my favourite coffee stops. Very popular with dog walkers and, well, walkers without dogs. And what you're looking at ahead of us is the wonderful Ald estuary. So to our left, upstream, we have the village of Snape, and right, going downstream, we've got Aldborough. This is very much a single track road. So Iken is one of these more sparsely populated villages, but the church, St Botolphs Church, which dates back to the 12th century, is very popular with pilgrim visitors, and it suffered from a fire in the 19th century, which pretty much destroyed the whole church, and it's been largely rebuilt. And when I was reading the history of the church, I was just sort of thinking to myself a little bit about the current situation where we've got Western governments becoming increasingly worried about the influence of media like TikTok, and how other, perhaps less friendly governments may be able to infiltrate our culture and influence our populations. And one could argue that other media like Facebook, YouTube, etc., have been able to again change the world through mass communication. And it seems to be something that is really concerning a lot of people. But what we're about to see demonstrates the fact that this is not the first time that the world has faced this problem. I'm going to change that word. I don't mean problem, I mean face this issue. Because not everyone will see it as an issue. So what do I mean when I say that it's not the first time we've had to face issues of ideas being imposed upon us from outside? Well, thinking about it, and this may be a somewhat controversial notion. If we consider that the Romans left Britain in the 5th century, by the 5th century they'd pretty much gone. The armies had been withdrawn, and bit by bit the Angles and Saxons and the Vikings began to take over. And yet, if I show you this, in the 12th century, the Romans were back, but not as an army, as a church, as a religion. And the dictates that came from the Vatican shaped just about every aspect of our society. So St Botolphs Church at Iken sits on this promontory right on the tidal estuary. Again, we're looking downriver towards Aldeburgh and bring the camera around, upriver towards Snape. It's interesting to think that when the church was rebuilt after the fire in the 19th century, apparently the thatch roof went up, they found evidence of Anglo-Saxon origins here. This road we're on now is the road that runs between Leiston and Saxmundham, and it's a great driving road. As you can see, lots of bends, but just have to be a little bit careful here because the road surface is a bit uneven and it can catch you out if you're not careful. But it's great fun. We're just going to take a left here, and the railway we're crossing is no longer used for passengers. In fact, it hasn't been since Dr. Beeching did his worst in the 60s, but it is used to transport spent nuclear waste from the power stations at Sizewell, and I guess it all sort of ends up somewhere at Sellafield in the end. A caravan park, a holiday caravan park called Cakes and Ales, but it's a little bit more than that, because those caravans are sitting on hard stands that were once occupied by P-51 Mustangs between 1944 and 45, and we are just about to cross an airfield which was home to what were locally colloquially known as the Oxford Boys. And this is a memorial to them. 1944 to 45 in July. This airfield was home to the 357th Fighter Group. Prior to that, the Thunderbolts of the 358th had flown here from November 43 to 44, and as you can see, the airmen that were lost are memorialised in these stones. I'll focus in case anyone watching has a connection with this airfield or relatives who might have been associated here. And you can pause the video if you want to and have a look at the names. It's hard to get a sense of scale here, but if I turn the camera around, for as far as you can see, following my finger along this line, we're looking at just one of the 3 runways which were purpose built to allow the fighter base here to escort all the heavy bombers from places like Parham, Framlingham across during the Second World War. And this site was used for fighters because we're only about 3 miles from the sea, and of course the real problem, particularly in the days of the Thunderbolts, was not being able to carry enough fuel to escort the bombers into the depths of Europe. That changed towards the end of the war once the Mustangs had drop tanks. But of course it also means that being here as a fighter base, you're able to intercept enemy aircraft coming the other way. But try to imagine the sound of these enormous Merlin engines in the case of the Mustangs and the vast radial engines of the P-47 Thunderbolts. And I imagine when you've got the squadrons lining up to take off along this runway, the whole earth must have shaken with the vibrations of the engines. And now all I can hear is a lawnmower. If we travel 3 miles following that hedgerow, we come to the sea, and the next place we're going to visit is an example of another endeavour in the face of a crisis. But like St Botolphs Church, we're going way back into history, and again we're looking at the period of the 12th century. So let's hop back in Tess and have a look, and you'll see what I mean. Now, I said we were going back to the 12th century, and as you'll notice, this sign clearly talks about these ruins being from the 14th century. But the fact is that this is a rebuilding of the 12th century abbey, and the 12th century abbey used to be located about 3 miles in that direction in what are now marshes, and because of the change in sort of local climate conditions, it became necessary to move the abbey because it continually flooded. So rather like St Botolphs Church, what we're looking at is a structure that exists as a result of Roman influence coming back to Britain in the 12th century. And then of course being destroyed a few hundred years later during the Reformation, when one could argue that Henry VIII decided to take Britain back. I seem to have heard those words before. This is a wonderful farmhouse which has been built into the abbey ruins, post-Reformation of course. And here we're looking at the great east window and altar. I guess my point is that the world changes, as Buddhist philosophy would have it. Nothing is permanent, and there's constantly a flow of new ideas and new values. Societies change, empires rise and fall, and sometimes empires come back but in a different form, and this may be an example. Just an idea, but tell me what you think in the comments below. I think I'm going to go and grab my morning cup of coffee. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care.